Be prepared to have your behaviour modified to save the world. And not for the first time either. The same tactics that were covertly applied to have the masses submit to COVID rules may yet be used again in the name of reaching the government's climate and environmental goals, if it's not already happening. A paper published by the House of Lords Environment and Climate Change Committee back in September 2022, entitled "In Our Hands, Behaviour Change for Climate and Environmental Goals," openly celebrates the success of what it describes as behaviour change interventions in support of what was described as a pandemic. Quote, "Lessons can be learned from both successful and unsuccessful behaviour change interventions in other policy areas, most notably the widespread behaviour change brought about by the COVID-19 pandemic." End quote. Not only were there no consequences for the deliberate deployment of a psy-op against an unsuspecting public kept in the dark on the matter, by nudge units using military-grade tactics to push the population in the direction the government wanted them to go. Not only were there no consequences then, but those tactics have not even gone away, and in pursuit of net zero and the rest of Agenda 2030 are surely looming again. On page 4 of the paper we read, quote, "It will be a major missed opportunity if the government does not seize the chance to evaluate behaviour change interventions implemented during the pandemic and apply lessons learned." Close quote. Let's remind ourselves what behaviour change was accomplished, shall we? By government-led misinformation, or as I prefer to call it, deliberate lying. The list is long, but let's recall how Granny and her untimely death if the grandkids didn't get jabbed was a constant refrain pushed by mainstream media and others. COVID-idiots, anti-vaxxers, granny killers, on and on goes the list of terms that were applied to any and all, credentialed specialists included, who'd dared to question any aspect of the rules, many of which, like the one about Scotch eggs, were whipped up on the hoof. From the beginning, there were legitimate questions to be asked about all of it, about face masks, about magic arrows on the floors of supermarkets, chained up play parks, police chasing joggers along empty beaches and through open countryside, hazard tape on park benches. And yet to do so, to ask those questions, was heresy. And yet, despite us knowing as much, the 2022 report about the prospect of seeking to modify our behaviour draws attention to how effective the government-approved broadcasting regulator was at helping control the message to the unsuspecting public, and licks its metaphorical lips at the prospect of doing the same again to push the climate crisis agenda. Quote, "During the pandemic, Ofcom applied rules on harmful content in the broadcasting code to COVID-19 misinformation, and Carnegie UK suggested that Ofcom could use the same approach in the context of misinformation about climate change and environmental damage. It's undenied fact that even the military, in the form of the 77th Brigade, a specialist British Army unit focused on information operations and psychological warfare, was among the tools deployed as so-called nudge units to herd the populace down the road to unquestioning obedience. I don't know how you feel about the idea of the powers that be using mind games and control of the media to get their way. If you're asking me, it makes me sick to my stomach. Knowing they did it all before, to manipulate an entire population into a state of fear that made most all too ready to do as they were told. That they know, we know that's what happened, and yet they're doing it all again in the name of net zero makes me furious. Do you think it's the job of those elected to serve, entrusted with the safeguarding of the people, to seek to change your behaviour? Are you happy with the thought of being made into some sort of performing seal, clapping on command? That those who claim to govern look back on what they did during the COVID debacle actions that ruined or ended lives and enabled the greatest transfer of wealth from poor to rich in all of history, and see it as a success worth building on, should have us all on our feet asking questions. Most galling to me is the celebration of the control of information made available to the tax-paying, law-abiding population that elected them to serve. During COVID, masses of information that might have helped people make, let's say, better informed choices about how to behave and what to do were ruthlessly suppressed. Information about the likely threat posed by whatever it was they called COVID, information about the side effects of the jabs, information about the damaging effects of extended wearing of face masks, information about the consequences for young and old alike of extended lockdowns, information about all of it that ran counter to the official narrative was deliberately denied to the people. Were you told that the emergency use authorization that permitted the rollout of jabs built on the mRNA platform was predicated on there being absolutely no alternative in terms of treatment? Or did you only see the posters on bus shelters of people appearing to be dying behind oxygen masks and the dread message, "Can you look them in the eyes?" as you struggled or fell under the restrictions? Were you told the authorities were aware of the risk of side effects like myocarditis, potentially lethal heart damage, before the first jab was offered? Or were all messages drowned out by the insistence that all you had to know was that they were safe and effective? Do you remember being told the hospitals were full of the unvaccinated when the opposite was true? Nudge, 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 nudge. And now that the COVID legend has run out of steam, at least for the time being, the same tactics of behavioural change, all about selective information, the selection being controlled and made by those in control of the narrative, are on the back burner, ready to be brought forward anytime the government chooses. Already the narrative on climate is screwed down tighter than the lid on a pressure cooker. Despite thousands of scientists around the world desperate to challenge the logic, or the lack of it, regarding net zero, according to the inhabitants of the House of Lords, what worked before to have us fear a pandemic and do as we were told could work again. Work against us, that is. And I quote once more, Ofcom could use the same approach, the same used during COVID, that is, in the context of misinformation about climate change and environmental damage. Ask yourself who gets to decide which is misinformation and which is truth. If you don't trust me, listen to award-winning journalist Alex Newman.
The notion that CO2 is pollution is absolutely preposterous. We exhale about 2 pounds of it every single day. The proportion of greenhouse gases made up of human CO2 emissions is a fraction of 1%. The idea that that is going to destroy the planet or change the temperature of the earth is, frankly, in my opinion, totally ludicrous. But from a totalitarian perspective, if you can convince people that CO2 is pollution, there's no human activity that doesn't result in CO2 emissions, including living, including dying, turning on a light switch. Every single aspect of your life then, if we submit to the idea that CO2 is pollution, then comes under the regulatory control of the people who claim to be saving us from pollution.
If we put up with knowing that nudge units for pity's sake, are out there, if we submit to the apparent certainty they remain to be deployed against us at a moment's notice for whatever reason, if they aren't deployed again already, then we accept the inevitability of being denied hearing contrary voices like Newman's.
So when they do these environmental studies and they say, well, your CO2 footprint will be smaller if you eat bugs or you do this, that, or the other, you drive an electric car, that doesn't show anything about whether that's going to benefit the environment or not. In fact, CO2 has actually been very beneficial for the environment. In interviewing Trump's climate advisor, Dr. William Happer, a physics professor at Princeton University, he said the Earth is starving for more CO2. And since we've had a little bit of an increase in atmospheric CO2 over the last 100 years or so, plants have gotten much greener, agricultural yields have improved. So I think we need to also talk about the fundamental presupposition here. Is CO2 really pollution? If it's not, then all these alleged environmental benefits are completely fictional.
It's hardly just one voice that will be silenced as inconvenient. Here is Greenpeace co-founder Dr. Patrick Moore Surely another one likely to be smothered by those listening to the suggestions about the utility of unilaterally deciding what is harmful content, misinformation, or just information inconvenient to the objective. Remember, quote, during the pandemic, Ofcom applied rules on harmful content in the broadcasting code to COVID-19 misinformation. Here is Dr. Moore giving the kind of opinion you may not be allowed to hear at all.
There are three things you need to know that this whole thing about the climate change disaster or catastrophe or emergency is false. First, it is not too hot now. It is one of the coldest periods in the history of the Earth. That's why there's all that ice on the poles, which it wasn't there. For 150 million years before this ice age, there was no ice anywhere on this Earth because it was warmer, much warmer than it is today. Second, CO2 is lower now in the atmosphere than it has been throughout nearly the entire history of the Earth. Right now it's at 420. During the most recent glacial maximum, it went down to 180 parts per million, which is not far above the death of plants, because plants don't just need CO2, they need a certain concentration of it. And even at 420, it is still nowhere near the optimum level for plants. It should be 800, 1200, and then you start getting a much lusher vegetation all over the world. And already the greening of the Earth, as a result of our emissions of CO2, is 30% increased growth in the lush areas in the world. And the third thing you need to know is that all the CO2 that we are putting into the atmosphere, where did it come from? How did it get in the fossil fuels? By plants pulling it out of the atmosphere and the oceans, the plankton in the sea, the vegetation on the land turned into coal, oil, and gas, and were lost from the air and the oceans. So all we're doing is replacing carbon dioxide. If there wasn't enough CO2 for the plants, we would all die too, because in the final analysis, plants are the bottom of the food chain. And so how can people be worried about putting CO2 back into the air and water, which was there in the first place? There's nowhere else it could have come from. It didn't come from Mars. It didn't come from the rocks. It came from the air and water, where it was much higher. And now we are replenishing the CO2 to a much better level than it had gone down to. We are the actual salvation of life on Earth. No other species could have done what we have done by burning the fossil fuels for energy.
I'm no expert, not on pandemics, not on climate, but I know I want to hear from all sides in any world-changing debate. For now, the likes of Dr. Moore can be heard online, but when did you last hear him and others like him raising contrary voices on mainstream channels? The adversary is so blatant now, openly considering and recommending the perceived need to change our behaviour, so we'll do what others want. Don't forget either that while our behaviour is set to be changed, those pushing that change on us will continue in their merry way with the best cuts of meat, private jets and super yachts. All of what I'm saying here comes before the perennially wise advice to follow the money, but that's a story for another day. When it comes to existential threats, I want and demand more information and not less. I want to decide for myself, having heard and read whatever I want, which sounds to me like misinformation and which sounds like the truth. We know they nudged us before. Do you want to be unknowingly nudged again? Fool me once, as the saying goes, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me.